This is Professor Lynn Porter from Fairfield University, and this is my lecture on comedy for my Intro to Theater class. As I did in my lecture on tragedy, I'm going to break this information up into two different categories: the effect of comedy on us as audience members, and then the recipe for comedy, what the playwright has to do in order to make the piece a comedy. So let's get started. What is the overall effect of comedy? Sounds like a simple question, doesn't it? Obviously, comedy allows us to laugh. We have great fun when we watch comedies. But it's more than just the physical response of laughter. Comedies give us permission to laugh at the characters. And that's not permission we have in regular life. We've been taught that it's rude, it's not nice to laugh at other people. No one wants to be the butt of a joke. No one wants to be laughed at. But comedy allows us to laugh at characters. But there's a little bit more to it than that. There's more to it than just breaking that social norm of not laughing at people. There's the idea that we all have fear, very great fear. And comedies give us permission to laugh at our deepest fears. And you might say, wait a minute, I'm not afraid of anything. Ah, but you are deep down inside. All of the comedies about romance and love, all of those poke fun at our fear that we're not going to find the love of our lives. We're not going to be able to get together with the person we're intended for. We have that fear. And so comedies around love relieve some of that pressure because we can laugh at that fear. If that fool in that comedy was able to eventually work it out and get together with their love, I suppose I could do it too. This is very similar to the idea with tragedy, that tragedies help us deal with our grief and the rage that comes from our grief. But now it's not grief, now it's just plain old fear that comedy allows us to address. And by laughing at our fears, we take away their power for a little while, but we've relieved some of that pressure of that fear. And if you're still thinking, wait a minute, I don't quite buy it, I want to offer a metaphor. In Harry Potter's world, there's a creature called a boggart. Now stay with me. A boggart is one of those strange and wonderful characters in the magical world of Harry Potter. In fact, it's an invisible kind of a creature. What does it look like? It takes the form of your greatest fear. So for every person, the boggart looks different. So we have a monster, a creature, something that needs to be fought, and it is our boggart. It's based on our own fears. But more than that, how do you get rid of a boggart? You have a charm in a particular way to move your wand, and the charm is ridiculous. And what you put behind that word is you try to imagine the most ridiculous, funniest thing you have ever experienced. And in imagining that ridiculous thing and laughing at it, the boggart can no longer be there and it disappears. So the boggart takes the shape of our fear by using the ridiculous charm and laughing at it because it is ridiculous. We end up getting rid of our boggart. In the movie version where we first meet a boggart, we see Neville Longbottom. He's quite terrified of Professor Snape. But then once he imagines Professor Snape wearing his grandmother's ridiculous clothing and her silly hat, It's easy for Neville to laugh at Professor Snape and get rid of that version of the boggart. So, comedy is a boggart. Comedy allows us to laugh at the things that we fear the most and allows us to set them aside for a while. You never kill a boggart, you just get rid of it for a while. And that's the same thing with comedy and our fears. So, more than just giving us an opportunity to have a lighthearted giggle, comedy does a whole lot more for us. Let's see what a playwright has to put into the play in order to make sure that it's a comedy. This is the recipe for comedy. And as before with the tragedy lecture, I'm going to break this down into these four different categories, starting with examining the characters. Comedies are about society. Comedies are frequently poking fun at things that we normally do in everyday society. So, unlike tragedy, which focuses on only one character, tragedy is all about that major protagonist. Comedy tends to be about the society that we are all living in. And in order to poke fun at society, you need to have a contrast. So we see in comedy that there is always a contrast between the normal social order of the world of the play and the individual. This can appear in one of two forms. You can have a crazy person in a normal world, or you can have a normal person in a crazy world. And by the contrast between the crazy and the normal, we start to see the ridiculousness of everyday life. For an example of each one of these categories, for crazy person in a normal world, we might look at the movie Wedding Crashers, where the two lead characters break all of the rules of society. They literally crash weddings, which is something you're not supposed to do. And in the world of that movie, you have all of these people who go to these normal weddings, and then you have these two guys who break the rules. And of course, wackiness ensues, but the wackiness is a result of their breaking that rule. They are breaking a major social norm by showing up to all of these wedding receptions and crashing the party. So, Wedding Crashers, I think, is a good example of crazy person or crazy people in a normal world. In fact, some actors make entire careers out of playing the crazy person. You have Jim Carrey and Adam Sandler, Will Ferrell, even Sandra Bullock and Meg Ryan. They framed their entire movie careers about being the waka waka person in a relatively normal world. Will Ferrell, that's another great example. Think of him in the movie Elf. Why is it so funny? The man is like 6 feet 5 inches tall. He's ridiculously big, and he thinks he's an elf. It's all about that contrast, comedy. If we want to look at the opposite, we might look at a movie like The Wizard of Oz, a normal person in a crazy world. Part of the reason the comedy works well in that movie is when Dorothy, in her Midwestern normal little dress and shoes and bobby socks, appears in Munchkin Land with witches and flying monkeys. So you have this crazy world, but the reason it's so fun is because we have this contrast. By having the contrast, we can see more clearly the extremes. But in thinking about characters in comedy, there's even more that's distinctive. In everyday life, we have a hierarchy of social power structures. The king is higher than the jester. The master is higher than the servant. The professor is higher than the student. So everyday life has these hierarchies. But in comedy, those get inverted. In fact, In fact, the most important part of understanding comedy is understanding that there's an upside downness to it all. Let me ask you this. In everyday life, who has the most power in this situation? A high school student or the vice principal? Clearly, the vice principal is the one on top. Yet, Ferris Bueller turns that completely upside down. And because Ferris is so much in charge of what happens in that movie, we root for him. He is much more powerful than that fool of a vice principal that he incessantly gets the better of. This upside down social structure is the beating center of it all. In fact, when you think about it, it's ridiculous. Let's move along to talking about the language in comedy. This one's pretty simple. Comedies are written in prose. And just a reminder, prose is a fancy word that means everyday language. Comedies have characters who are lower status, now in a high status situation. And so because they're low status, we are also using low status language. We're using everyday language. But what about the plot direction? Think about it. Ferris Bueller? That's a ridiculous situation. Will Ferrell as an elf? How totally ridiculous. And these situations, they are not mildly amusing situations. They're not gently silly situations. They are over the top, totally ridiculous situations. Like I said, comedy is about these extremes. So the situations themselves are totally redonkulous. And even though we see characters who often are breaking our social norms, we always, from the very beginning, have this overriding sense that everything will eventually turn out okay. We don't worry that, oh dear, this is ridiculous. Somebody's going to die here. There's going to be a pile of dead bodies by the end of this one. No, we think that in a tragedy. But in a comedy, we always know from the very beginning everything's going to turn out okay. And part of this is because we never really worry that the characters are going to get hurt. Even if they are in a fight, even if they're in a car accident, even if they accidentally run off a cliff, as happens in cartoons, they may fall, they may make a great big hole in the ground, but they're also going to walk away from that great big hole. They don't die. The threat level to characters in a comedy is very, very low. Even going back to the example of Wedding Crashers, we don't ever worry that our lead guys are going to end up getting arrested or having to actually pay for some of the things they're doing. No, they're going to get away with it. They're going to be just fine. That's true in all comedies. Ferris is going to be just fine. Our elf is going to be fine. So let's look at some of the choices that our characters make. In comedies, you see characters making selfish choices, expedient choices. You don't see them making ethical choices. You don't see them making morally right choices. It is not morally right to crash people's wedding parties. It's not morally right to take a day off from high school and go play. But that's what we see our characters do in comedy. Absolutely. Selfish choices, but with a low level of threat. So we never worry that they're going to get hurt. We know it's all going to turn out okay. And this is one of the areas that makes the difference between comedy and tragedy so clear. Characters making selfish choices. In comedies, contrast that with tragedies, where our central character always makes the noble choice, the ethical choice. That nobility is central to the idea of tragedy, and it has nothing to do with comedy. In fact, comedies go beyond all of this, and you see a suspension of natural laws. Sometimes, like in cartoons, the natural laws we see suspended are the law of gravity. When the character runs off the cliff, what happens? Do they immediately fall to their bloody death? No. Actually, they keep running out into mid-air. And it's a cartoon convention that characters can run on air until they realize, oh, wow, I ran off a cliff. And once they make that realization, what happens? They start to fall, and they fall for a really long time. And eventually, way down there, they land in this little of dust. We've suspended the law of gravity. We've suspended how long it takes to fall from the top of the cliff to the bottom of the ravine. All of those are natural laws that we have completely turned off. It's really easy to see the suspension of natural laws when we're talking about cartoons. It's a little bit harder to see them when we talk about movies with real people in them. So the laws we're talking about here are social laws. Going back to the wedding crashers again, they're breaking a law by crashing parties. That's their thing. But that is totally outside the realm of what is socially acceptable. So there's the socially acceptable natural law, and then we see characters breaking it in a flagrant ways. So sometimes the natural laws that we're suspending are actually social laws on how we're supposed to be in a civilized society. And I want to point out that this is another kind of inversion. We talked about the social structure being upside down, but this is upside down too. Comedies, by their very nature, are upside down, including how they treat the natural laws. So, how do comedies resolve? Everybody comes out just fine. The low level of threat has come to pass. The characters do their silly things that they do. They're still working on resolving their MDQ, leading to a climax. Everything to do with plot structure still holds true with all the genres. But I want to point out that everybody comes out just fine. In fact, you can look at comedy as a celebration of the craziness of life, the ridiculousness of life. So frequently you will see comedies that end with a very formal celebration of that, with a feast or with a dance. Those are the rituals we do to mark the important events in our lives. And I remember being a college student and learning this about comedy and thinking, no, that's not true. Comedies don't end with feasts or with dances. But think about it. How many comedies end up at a wedding reception? Isn't that a feast with a dance involved? There you go. Comedy. So, summing up all of this, putting comedy into a nutshell, we see that comedies have ridiculous situations, not just mildly amusing, they're totally ridiculous, they're upside down, and they have that low level of threat to the characters. And that leads to an interesting response for us in the audience. Because we know the characters are not going to be harmed, we allow ourselves to laugh at them. And we laugh at them because we have a low level of empathy with them. We haven't identified with them on a personal level. Think about it. In everyday life, when we are deeply emotionally connected to someone, we don't laugh at them when they're going through a rough time. No, we don't laugh at our friends who fall down on the icy sidewalk. We might want to, but we know it's not right. It's not socially acceptable. So comedies allow us as audience to break our own social norms, and we laugh at these characters. And why do we all love comedy? Comedies reassure us everything's going to turn out fine. Even when things are upside down, it's all going to work out just fine. In fact, we celebrate the ridiculousness of life. And on a very deep level, we are confronting our deepest fears. We're taming our deepest fears. And for a little bit, we take some of the pressure off of those fears that lurk deep within us. And I want to point out something that I have not talked about at all in this comedy lecture. I haven't talked about a requirement that the play is funny. I've talked about us being allowed to laugh at characters, but comedies do not have to be funny. I hope you're understanding that what makes a comedy is a structural thing. It is not a funny thing. There's no laugh-o-meter involved here. Comedy is structural. So there you have it. There you go. There it is. My lecture on comedy. Thanks for your attention.